Hey everyone, today we're diving into some of the wildest ways UFC fighters have been kicked out of the octagon. We're not talking about getting cut due to financial reasons or anything like that. Instead, we're exploring those jaw-dropping moments where fighters got themselves fired by making huge mistakes or breaking the rules. You might think that if you're a professional fighter, there aren't many ways to get yourself fired. But MMA history shows us that fighters can mess up in some pretty outrageous ways. And if you're not a big star, the UFC has a zero-tolerance policy. They'll drop you in a heartbeat if you can't keep it together. I'm Bailey from On Point, and a huge shout out to all our channel members who support us every month. You guys rock! Now let's get into the 10 most ridiculous ways UFC fighters have lost their jobs. Number 10. Jeff Molina. Who remembers Jeff Molina? He made a splash on the Contender Series with a 7-2 record, and then set a record in his UFC debut for the most strikes attempted in a single round. His UFC career started off strong, but things took a turn due to his connection with another fighter, James Krause. James Krause, a UFC fighter and the head coach at Glory MMA, was involved in a scandal. In November 2022, the Nevada State Athletic Commission spotted some suspicious betting activity linked to Krause's fighters. This mess ended up costing Molina his spot in the UFC.
Fights that you're involved in, will you bet on those too?
Yeah.
This turned into a major scandal. James Krause first came under investigation for allegedly knowing about his fighter, Derek Min's injury before a fight, and then betting against him. But things got worse. It turned out Krause was allegedly involved in an online betting group that broke a lot of gambling laws, and even worked with offshore sports books. The UFC took a hard stance. If you train with or associate with Krause, you're banned from UFC competition during the investigation. Jeff Molina, who trained with Krause, was suspended. The Nevada State Athletic Commission decided Molina also needed an investigation, and they wouldn't allow him to fight until it was over. As a result, the UFC cut Molina from their roster, considering it a violation of their athlete code of conduct. It's pretty harsh, especially since Molina's involvement in betting on the sport he competed in led to his firing. Number 9. Diego Sanchez. Next up is Diego Sanchez, who had been with the UFC since the very first season of The Ultimate Fighter, a season that helped save the promotion. You'd think he'd have a respectful exit, but things took a strange turn thanks to his new coach, Joshua Fabia. After 13 years with the UFC, Diego, who was nearing the end of his career, sought out new coaching and found Joshua Fabia. The issue? Some really odd coaching videos started surfacing, showing bizarre advice Fabia was giving Diego.
Think of the shadow. Shadow, I need you to get in. Okay, get in, get behind.
Listening to that last corner work was very strange.
We knew that this guy was not qualified for the job, and by the time Diego figured that out himself, it was too late now. Weird training isn't enough to get yourself fired. But one day, Josh called the UFC brass with a very strange,
for a quote, formal request for all of Diego's pre-fight medical records, every physician that he has ever been evaluated by, that the quote, long-term effects of Diego being an MMA fighter were your basis for requesting it.
Hunter Campbell soused out that the only reason you'd ask for information like that is if you're planning a lawsuit, and if Diego is unfit to fight, then he's going to be let go. It was as simple as that.
If you're concerned or he's concerned that he's having negative effects, then we're not going to fight him.
So, Coach Josh Fabia ended up getting Diego Sanchez fired. The UFC wasn't pleased with the bizarre questions and tactics Fabia was using, so they decided it was safer to let Diego go. It's better to cut ties than deal with a trainer who seems out of touch. Number 8. Matt Riddle. Let's talk about Matt Riddle. The debate about drugs in MMA has been going on for years. Steroids are a big no-no, but marijuana, it's usually seen as less of an issue now. Many commissions have relaxed their stance on weed. Still, getting suspended for it might seem outdated. Matt Riddle is a prime example of this. You only need to know him for a minute to see he's a big fan of marijuana. The issue isn't that he likes weed. What's really dumb is that Riddle just didn't follow the rules.
I did fail 2 drug tests for marijuana that I'm prescribed by a doctor, so I really don't see the problem.
I'm sorry guys, but even people like Joe Rogan have said that weed, it can help you in MMA.
I think it might actually enhance you. There's a lot of guys who like to do marijuana and do jiu-jitsu. And you could also argue that marijuana helps you absorb pain.
Eventually, though, even though Matt was winning, Dana White had just had enough of his stoner mentality failing drug tests and straight up fired him.
You're so weak-minded and so addicted to marijuana that you couldn't stay off it enough to pass a drug test 3 times a year.
All Riddle had to do was lay off the weed for a few weeks, but he didn't. So yeah, he got fired for refusing to stop using marijuana. It was a tricky time because some fighters were getting TRT exemptions, and if Riddle had a medical card, it might have been a different story. But at that moment, he just couldn't stick to the rules.
They allow fighters like Vitor Belfort take steroids. They let them take TRT, testosterone replacement therapy, and they think it's acceptable because they have a doctor's note.
Number 7, Dennis Hallman. These days, Dana White doesn't get asked too many tough questions, but it's always entertaining when he does get really fired up. He's had some legendary rants, but one that stands out for pure disappointment happened after UFC 133. Dennis Hallman walked out to the fight wearing nothing but Speedos. Dana White was not impressed at all, and the whole thing was a big reason why Hallman ended up getting fired. Sometimes it's not just about what happens in the cage, but also how you carry yourself before and after the fight.
I'd call it disgusting. That was disgusting. It will never happen again, I can guarantee you that.
Hallman's choice to wear Speedos was a huge letdown for Dana White. Apparently, Hallman had lost a bet, but Dana didn't see the humor in it and was clearly not pleased. Hallman wasn't fired right away, but things quickly went south. He missed weight in his next fight, got injured, and his matchup with Tony Ferguson was canceled. He tried to reschedule a fight with Thiago Tavares 3 times, but missed weight again each time. His contract wasn't renewed, which is basically the same as being fired. It's clear that Dana was looking for a reason to let him go, and Hallman's Speedo stunt gave him just that. In hindsight, it probably wasn't worth it. Number 6, Caleb Starn. It's rare to hear someone being called the laughingstock of MMA, especially considering how tough fighters are. But Caleb Starnes earned that title after his fight against Nate Quarry. This was a relatively low-profile fight, but it became infamous for all the wrong reasons. Starnes didn't engage at all and just ran away for most of the match. The crowd was relentless, booing him loudly. To add to the humiliation, Nate Quarry started mocking Starnes by doing the running man dance. It was a performance so bad that it's now part of MMA legend for all the wrong reasons.
I don't think we need to translate what that meant. I know exactly what that meant.
The fight between Caleb Starnes and Nate Quarry went down as one of the worst performances in UFC history. Starnes' non-stop running and lack of engagement led to him being dubbed the laughingstock of MMA. The reaction was brutal, and Dana White made it clear that Starnes didn't belong in the UFC. If you're going to be in the UFC, you need to fight, not just run away while thousands of fans boo you. If you can't handle that, you probably won't have a job much longer. Number 5, Muhammad Mokaev. There's a saying in MMA, don't fight outside the cage if you're getting paid to do it inside the cage. Sometimes fighters like John Jones or DC let their tempers get the best of them, but it's generally a bad idea to get fired for a fight that isn't even scheduled. Muhammad Mokaev and Manel Kape had a few backstage clashes leading up to their fight. 4 weeks before their bout, they had a scuffle at the UFC Performance Institute. By fight week, tensions were high. Mokaev tried to apologize with a photo op, but then he sucker punched Kape. It's pretty dumb to ruin your chances with a pre-fight brawl, especially when you've already signed a contract to face off in the Octagon. The UFC is in the business of putting on fights in front of large audiences, not in hotel lobbies. All these backstage antics just added up, and security swarmed the cage before the fight even started.
Oh my God, they're stopping Manel Kape from getting that in. They are gonna fight.
And the fight ended up being pretty boring, and in the end anyway, and Dana White decided just not to resign.
I think the PFL is going to get a great undefeated guy.
What's even crazier is that not even Muhammad Mokaev's undefeated record or UFC win streak could save him from getting cut. Number 4, Jesse Taylor. Let me tell you about Jesse Taylor. His story is so outrageous it's hard to believe. Taylor was a contestant on The Ultimate Fighter when the show was at its peak. By the time he reached the finale, he was feeling like a superstar. He even had a Monster Energy sponsorship, and he hadn't lost a fight on the show. But then disaster struck. Taylor went on a rampage in a Vegas hotel, causing chaos and destruction. It was such a bad look that Dana White decided he was done with the UFC. Taylor's wild behavior was too much of a risk. Despite his impressive performance on the show, it cost him his spot in the UFC.
You're not ready.
But here's where things get wild. Dana White did give Jesse Taylor another chance in the UFC. He had one fight, one shot to make things right. Unfortunately, Taylor tapped out to a Peruvian necktie in the first round, and just like that, he was out of the UFC again. It was a huge missed opportunity, and for such a silly reason. But Jesse didn't give up. 9 years later, he got another shot at redemption. He returned to The Ultimate Fighter, made it to the finale, and actually won the show this time. An incredible story of coming full circle. However, things took another turn for the worse when he tested positive for steroids. Despite all his hard work to get back into the UFC, he was fired immediately. It's a tough pill to swallow, especially after his amazing comeback. All that effort was undone by a poor decision. Number 3, Hatsuhioki. In MMA, when someone taps out, it's over. No one needs to get seriously hurt. But not everyone gets this. Hatsuhioki's firing stemmed from an incident with a fighter named Hamar Pal Harris, who was known for not letting go of submissions even when opponents tapped. Harris's behavior was certainly reckless, but he had a tough upbringing, which might explain, though not excuse, his actions. Still, it was extremely dangerous and unnecessary. Even more shocking was an incident involving longtime veteran Babalu Sobral. After making a name for himself in the early 2000s and returning to the UFC in 2005, Babalu was given a chance to bounce back with a fight against David Heath. During the fight, Heath said some disrespectful things at the weigh-in. In the fight, Babalu dominated Heath, eventually sinking in a choke. When Heath started tapping, Babalu didn't let go right away. It wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was a blatant disregard for the rules and the safety of his opponent. That kind of behavior was unforgivable and led to his firing. It's a classic example of how ignoring the fundamentals of sportsmanship can end a career.
Oh, Babalu did not let go and put David Heath to sleep even after David Heath tapped.
He was immediately booed into oblivion, and then what he said on the mic did not help either.
Put him to sleep on purpose even though you knew that he tapped.
Yes, he has to learn respect.
Dana White was quick to act after Babalu Sobral's incident. He fired Sobral immediately before the next UFC event with no remorse. Dana said the fans had turned against Sobral and that it was a huge mistake to let things get that far. Number 2, fighters who can't control their hands. You'd think that after weeks of intense training and focusing on your opponent, you'd be able to recognize them easily, especially to avoid making a mistake like punching the referee. But believe it or not, this kind of mix-up has happened in the UFC. Take Jason High, for example. After losing to Rafael dos Anjos, High was furious about the stoppage and got up to push the referee. Dana White said it made him sick and immediately fired High. The UFC's zero-tolerance policy on attacking officials makes sense. Fighters can't go around hitting referees. In a slightly different case, Hector Lombard had a problem at the end of round 1 against CB Dollaway. Despite the buzzer signaling the end of the round, Lombard threw 2 more punches that knocked Dollaway down and almost out. Ignoring the buzzer and continuing to attack after the round was over didn't sit well with the UFC, and Lombard faced consequences for his actions.
This fight's over.
It's over. It's going to be a DQ win for CB Dollaway.
Lombard did get one more UFC fight after the incident with CB Dollaway, but it didn't change much. The negative impact of his actions was already done. Number 1, Paul Daley. Many fans remember the infamous moment when British fighter Paul Daley faced off against American Josh Koscheck. Daley had been eager to land a big punch on Koscheck throughout the fight. After 15 minutes of not getting his chance, Daley took a swing at Koscheck right after the final bell. This was a huge breach of conduct, and the UFC didn't hesitate to react. Daley's actions were considered unacceptable, and he was immediately cut from the roster. It's a prime example of how letting emotions get the best of you can end your career in the UFC.
Oh! Daley punches Koscheck at the end of the fight.
Dana White cut Paul Daley faster than Ben Askren can slip through a watermelon. Daley lost control of his emotions and threw a punch at Josh Koscheck after the final bell. It was a reckless move, and Daley never fought in the UFC again. He probably feels pretty foolish about that punch now, unless, of course, it was worth it to him to take a swing at Koscheck. Dishonorable mention, Ottman Azatar. Before we get to number 1, let's talk about Ottman Azatar. During the pandemic lockdown at Fight Island, Azatar was caught in a bizarre situation. He allegedly cut off his wristband, gave it to someone else, who then scaled 4 balconies to deliver a suspicious bag of potatoes or whatever was inside. Azatar was immediately fired for this stunt. He was a top prospect, but his attempt at smuggling something into the facility cost him his UFC career. It was a pretty dumb move. Number 1, Igor Sviridov. So we've covered a lot of ways fighters can mess up, but some actions are beyond the pale. In combat sports, biting your opponent is a line you just don't cross. Mike Tyson's infamous bite in 1997 cost him a chance to reclaim his world title and led to a hefty fine from the Nevada State Athletic Commission. That was a landmark case, and biting in the sport had been rare since then. However, in April 2024, the UFC had a shocker when Igor Sviridov decided to bite his opponent, Andre Lemur, during their fight. This move was just as shocking as it was unacceptable. In a sport where maintaining control is crucial, resorting to such extreme tactics crosses a line that can't be undone.
Oh, jeez.
Okay, yeah, come on. See that.
Okay.
Never mind.
Igor Sviridov's biting incident was incredibly blatant. Thankfully, the referee spotted it immediately and the fight was stopped right away. There was no question about it. Sviridov was cut from the UFC on the spot. The whole thing was baffling. Sviridov didn't even try to hide his actions. While a 6-month suspension was recommended, they ultimately decided on 9 months. Sviridov claimed he got hit so hard that he didn't remember what happened. But unless he's been practicing biting at the gym, it's hard to understand why he'd use his teeth in the middle of a fight. Maybe he has a thing for zombies or was inspired by Jaws, but in MMA, biting is a definite no-no. If you enjoyed this video, let us know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.